Hello, everyone. I'm Prashani, and I'll be chairing the session today. Welcome to you all. I'd like to start by just saying a little bit before I introduce our speaker today. Or let me actually start with Fabio, because Fabio is part of the community I want to speak about and the kind of issues I want to center beyond Fabio's paper today. But I'll just take a few minutes. Fabio Luis Barbosa dos Santos is he's joined us for just over a year now from the Federal University of Sao Paulo, where he is a professor of Latin American Studies. He has a PhD in economic history and has written many books, the titles of some of which you will find at the back of the working paper he's produced with us today. But I want to say a little more than just about the kind of academic work that Fabio has done. We met in 2016 first as part of a collaboration started at and through SWOP with colleagues from BRICS countries, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and framed in the first instance by the BRICS model, but also thinking from the positions of different communities within those countries, activists as well as academics. And the work we've been trying to do across SWOP has involved very different ways of thinking about doing comparative research. And this is one example of what has come out of that attempt, which has been a collective attempt amongst some of us from the Global South. And I think even though we exist in the privileged space of the university and we understand the Global North to be one of privilege and the Global South to be one of disadvantage, even within the university, some of us in the Global South are disadvantaged even within the university. So I just want to emphasize that this work has taken some time, but it has also taken care, and care with each other, for critique, but also for being able to build and shape new approaches to comparative studies and interdisciplinary methods. Some of you would have heard Fabio present earlier this year in our program around the elections, a very different paper, but today he is giving us a political economy perspective and a comparative perspective. He was very reluctant in the last session to actually answer any questions about South Africa in relation to Brazil because he was taking care and time with what he was thinking and working through. And I think that's also sat at the center of all of our work, and we want to emphasize the importance of slow, careful research in making and shaping these collaborations. So yeah, we're going to hear Fabio, but I also want to, at the very beginning, because some of you I know will have to leave early, say a very big thank you to the SWOP team, and say a special welcome and introduce you to our newest member of the team, Nirian Tolsi. Lesego Loate is not here, but he has also recently just joined us, so we're looking forward to having you be part of our team. And then the existing team, Lindiwe Malindi, sitting here quietly, who has pulled together the lunch break program over the year, and today is our last lunch break, so thank you, Lindy. Tasneem and Simon, who sit quietly here, and their labor is really not seen in making these events successful and comfortable. So I just wanted to also say thank you to them, and Danelle Skosana will be joining us later, as well as Lucinda Bokoni, who can't be with us today. So thanks to all of you, and yeah, I'm not going to say anything about the paper, but we'll take some questions and hopefully have a nice discussion following that. Fabio.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Prashani. Thank you, all my SWOP colleagues for hosting this discussion, and beyond this discussion for hosting me along this year where I'm having the opportunity to live and investigate and get acquainted with South Africa on a deeper level, although not as deep as one I would like to. Yes, that would take much longer. I hope to keep these collaborations going. So the talk that I bring today, it's entitled After the Rainbow. So the idea being that to look at South Africa's politics with Brazilians' lens. And Brazilians' lens can be ugly lens. But before going into that, I'll briefly bring India into the picture to outline a broader framework that I believe is helpful to my argument. So the talk is going to consist of a brief introduction followed by 3 arguments that I will soon outline. So Brazil, South Africa and India are among the countries that have gone further down the industrialization path in the global south. However, in the 1970s on, the erosion of the national development landscape had intertwined political and economic consequences. The end of dictatorship in Brazil and the dismantling of apartheid in South Africa ushered in new hegemonic democratic arrangements. In Brazil, the citizen constitution drafted in 1988 was the linchpin of the new republic that followed, while the end of apartheid also gave birth to a socially advanced constitution underpinning what I'll dub as the Rainbow Nation framework. In short, new hegemonies were established. The Indian case was different. Like Brazil and South Africa, the waning of the national development landscape prompted neoliberalization and globalization and neoliberalism. But unlike in Brazil and South Africa, there was no political breakthrough. As the Cold War petered out, new liberalization was carried out by the National Liberation Party, who was then in power. Henceforth, the erosion of Congress hegemony, Indian National Congress hegemony, was gradual but consistent. BJP-led Hindu nationalism had its first full stint in power between 1998 and 2006, but that was followed by 2 Congress governments. But since Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, a clear hegemonic shift took place towards Hindu nationalism, the Indian idiom of hate politics that brews worldwide. If hate politics pointed the way out of the hegemonic interregnum in India, could that be the way forward, if forward that is, in Brazil and South Africa? Seen through this lens, Bolsonaro's presidency emerges as a provisional response of a ruling class seeking a way out of the new republic. At the same time, Lula's comeback is a reaction to the unforeseen dangers involved in that path. In South Africa, hate politics hasn't been embodied by a specific leader or party, but it hovers over the political environment across ideological lines. Could that be an indication that a hegemonic shift is more advanced in Brazil than in South Africa, while it took place in India a decade ago? So, this is just to state my overall question. So my overall question is, what are we to expect in the global south when 20th century hegemonic arrangements are in crisis in a world drifting to the right? So having that background in mind, I'll discuss contemporary politics in Brazil and South Africa, and the comparison is framed by a hypothesis that both countries face a hegemonic crisis or a hegemonic crisis, and an interregnum is taking place. So against this backdrop, I'll raise 3 issues. Firstly, I'll look at corruption as a symptom of the constraints for sustained capital accumulation and class building in the margins of global capitalism in the 21st century, that is to say, in Brazil and South Africa. This adds to legitimacy challenges to the new republic and rainbow nation hegemonies. And in this context, I will frame the ongoing political dynamics as a crisis containment approach as embodied by the PT or Ramaphosa, as opposed to acceleration of crisis embodied by Zuma or Bolsonaro. The key difference here being that while the first tries to contain the depletion of the prevailing hegemonic settlements, the second accelerates its breakdown. As a consequence, the political divide is displaced between those political forces that aim to preserve the institutional settlement and those undermining the prevailing institutional settlement. And I argue that this is the rationale behind the ANC teaming up with the DA for a government of national unity. So in short, the 3 questions that I ask are, why a hegemonic crisis? What are the political, and if the hegemonic crisis there is, so what is the political dynamic underpinning it? And where do they point to? So I'll start with corruption as a symptom. The ebbing of the Cold War brought hegemonic shifts in Brazil and South Africa. Even though these changeovers took place within capitalism, they were fraught with expectations of social democratization coupled with bourgeois rearrangements, albeit different ones. The Brazilian bourgeoisie had to update and modernize, while a new black bourgeoisie was to be created in South Africa. A durable hegemony depended on successful patterns of capital accumulation underpinning these class rearrangements, all those tied to significant levels of social integration. Failing to do so compromises legitimacy and is likely to be offset by violence, as happened in both countries during the Cold War. As you all know, the end of apartheid brought the end of economic blockade in times of globalization. In that context, the ANC's original egalitarian and nationalist goals were compromised, and the focus shifted to creating a black bourgeoisie. The core drive was not to democratize society, but to deracialize capitalism, which led to black economic empowerment policies. Zuma administration built on and accelerated black economic empowerment, political and economic dynamics, escalating it to state capture. Unlike Mbeki's previous approach, radical economic transformation was not to rest on the goodwill of whites, making this vision profoundly compelling. What I want to underscore here is that corruption became a key feature to accelerate an elite formation process under Zuma, deepening the informal political economic web that cut across black economic empowerment. Von Holt argues that Zuma's rise accelerated ongoing trends, producing a quality shift. If corruption can be seen as a form of accumulation by dispossession, corruption under Zuma was linked to a class formation process amounting to primitive accumulation. However, corruption is a mode of accumulation that is not mediated by legal forms. In other words, it's illegal, it's outlawed. Insofar as an illegal peripheral feature becomes its core, the system is threatened. While accumulation by dispossession was inherent to neoliberalism in the Mandela-Mbeki years, Zuma's gear change produced a quality shift that ultimately undermined the institutional framework on which the ANC's hegemony is founded. I'll now shift to Brazil. The climax of the PT's claim to hegemony was the new developmentalist blueprint that got on track in Lula's second term, that was between 2007 and 2010, when there was a growth spurt driven by rising commodity prices due to Chinese expansion. New developmentalism bottom line was that the country should seek an alternative route between the financialization that characterized neoliberalism and the nationalism linked to developmentalism. So the opportunity to reconcile an external element, liberalism, with an internal element, Brazilian developmentalism, materialized in the support for the internationalization of large companies with national capital or headquartered in the country, the so-called national champions policies. The main vehicles of these policies was the business diplomacy practiced by Brazilian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the so-called Itamaraty, and the credit policy of the National Bank for Economic and Social Development, BNDES. This internationalization of Brazilian corporations corresponded to a political project of regional leadership. The economic expansion of Brazilian business would serve as the foundation for the country's international political upliftment, making Brazil a global player. This proposal advanced with relative success during the economic expansion cycle that lasted until the first Dilma Rousseff's term. Dilma Rousseff is the person that succeeded Lula in the presidency. That was from 2011 on. The expansion of Brazilian business corresponded to recognition of the country's political role, embodied in the figure of President Lula, who was then seen by Obama as the most popular politician on earth. However, the conjunction of economic downturn and corruption scandals from 2014 on thwarted this project. While the Brazilian economy entered recession, several reports described corruption schemes involving contractors and other national champions at home and abroad. These disclosures undermined the reliability of the government and its ruling party, jeopardizing the new developmentalist project which they upheld. The impeachment of President Rousseff in 2016 spelled the death knell of new developmentalism. However, as the PT embodied post-dictatorship hopes for social change, its downfall had implications beyond the party's fate, signaling that the new republic itself was compromised. From the economic point of view, although financial accumulation supported by accumulation by dispossession traversed the new republic, the Bolsonaro government raised this drive to a new level, brushing off any social and environmental concerns. On top of that, militias or extortion rackets and other organized criminal operations linked directly with different levels of the state apparatus have been given a free hand. While militias and their connection to the state are also not new, under Bolsonaro the boundaries between the two were further blurred. Militias, narco-traffic, evangelicals and finance thrived under Bolsonaro, but none of them produced value other than drugs, which are illegal. What kind of elite can such a political economy produce? So when you look at this, both cases, so what we're seeing that corruption is playing a key role in the building up of a class formation project, and in the undoing of a class formation, not a class formation process, but a class, let's say, going international process in Brazil. So the question that I ask, or the questions that I ask, could corruption be a symptom of constraints faced by capitalist development in these countries as global capital is mired in a structural crisis? A burgeoning capital system was the background of the buildup of an Afrikaner bourgeoisie and of Brazilian national developmentalism in the past century. What kind of accumulation and class formation can be engendered on its margins on Brazil and South Africa when global capital is embedded in a structural crisis? So what I'm trying to suggest here is that the conditions, the structural conditions to the building up of an Afrikaner bourgeoisie in the 20th century were very different from those faced by, let's say, the building of a black bourgeoisie in the 21st century. The common thread between, we can discuss that later. The common thread between state capture under Zuma and dispossession acceleration under Bolsonaro is that they're driven by non-civilized patterns. Oh, I'll skip that. This is part of the argument, but I'll skip that. So the common thread between state capture under Zuma and dispossession acceleration under Bolsonaro is that they're driven by so-called non-civilized patterns of accumulation, insofar as accumulation tends not to be mediated by a juridical form but by violence. Consequently, state institutions and regulations were seen. So those pictures were basically to show. I was going to allude to when Glencore was displaced by Tegeta, which from a party report that I read, I understand that Glencore at that time was already widely managed and by black personnel. So it was just, there was no black economic empowerment veneer around that. And then when we look at Brazilian military displacing a criminal faction in Rio de Janeiro favela, so that another criminal faction with whom they are connected takes place. So what I'm trying to suggest is that violence is, in the opinion, is a shift, but So let me go back again to my argument. So there are different, of course, there are different state capabilities and different rent seeking, but the core drive between them is just a clash around rent seeking possibilities. So what if these violence breeding illegalities are not economic distortions but symptoms of the past open and of the past not open to capital accumulation in these countries in the 21st century? If disregard for the prevailing laws and institutions are the way to go and accumulate, what is to be done of the new republic and of the rainbow nation? So I now move to the second part of the argument. Structural constraints to expanded accumulation posed an additional challenge to the ANC's and to the PT's capacity to advance black economic empowerment and new developmentalism, and connect those processes to social equality aspirations. In other words, they undermine their hegemony bid. Nevertheless, both parties are in the presidency today. However, the expectations they bear are very different from 3 decades ago, and so are government conditions, as both parties have allied with former foes. If expectations of social change are spent, what do these governments stand for? And those opposing them, where do they point to? So I suggest that these governments embody attempts of hegemonic crisis containment that are impotent to revert crisis. So the containment approach, I'll start with Brazil. The containment approach implies that the PT government didn't address the causes of corrosive trends that preceded and embroiled them, but designed a broad set of sophisticated social policies aiming to mitigate its effects. Containment was not ineffective, but it was incapable of reversing the social disembedding trend. On the contrary, the politics of crisis containment implies resorting to practices, devices, and policies that actually accelerate the crisis it intends to contain. In other words, containment implies strengthening the very forces it intends to hold at bay, as two examples from the Lula government show. During Lula's first term, a bribery scandal broke out as the PT was found to be paying monthly allowances to ensure parliamentary support of small political parties, the so-called Mensalão scheme. As a response to that crisis, to that political crisis, the PT struck an alliance with the then largest party in the parliament, the PMDB party. As a result of that alliance, PT nominated PMDB leader Michel Temer twice as vice president on Dilma Rousseff's ticket. While in the vice presidency, Temer became a key plotter against Rousseff, who was eventually deposed in 2016. Then, Temer occupied the presidency before Bolsonaro was elected 2 years later. So in short, what my argument is, in order to contain a political crisis unleashed by a bribery scandal, key actors in the acceleration of crisis that followed and that led to Rousseff's deposition were strengthened. A second example is related to the military. Early in his presidency, Lula sent the Brazilian military to command the United Nations peacekeeping mission in Haiti. And as a footnote, it's interesting to know that the Haiti president who was then deposed, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, he was exiled in Mbeki, South Africa. End of the footnote. So Brazilian leadership was conceived as part of the broader design to make the country a global player. But the military thought otherwise. They had different ideas. It is no secret that the Brazilian military saw Haiti as an opportunity for training and experimentation with violent social management techniques on poor black populations. Back home, many became convinced that the army should engage in similar missions domestically. In the meantime, politicians willing to wield a heavy hand at the local level were demanding military involvement. But the federal government led the way, as the military was deployed on a wide array of so-called extraordinary missions, ranging from the pacification of Rio de Janeiro's favelas to replacing state police when they went on strike. They were also handed responsibilities over the 2014 World Cup and the 2016 Olympic Games in Rio. So the point is, the same military men who were empowered in civil affairs under the PT ended up filling top posts in the Bolsonaro government. So to enlist the armed forces' support, or at least to neutralize its hostility, the PT government thrust the military to the front line of its global ambitions, while counting on them to contain potential domestic unrest. The PT government promoted the civil empowerment of the institution that became the linchpin of Bolsonaro's government. So to sum up the argument, so beyond presidential goodwill, we're facing a political dynamic that is inherently contradictory. The attempt to contain crisis fails because it implies strengthening agents of crisis. Perhaps a graphic image of that is the Brumadinho Valley Dam collapse way, but I can explain that later. Seen through this lens, the best way to describe the links between the defenestration of the PT and the rise of Bolsonaro is not a 180-degree U-turn, such as when Allende was deposed by Pinochet in Chile in 1973. It is a sort of a metastasis in the sense that corrosive forces that were never questioned but seemed controlled under the PT later spread and challenged through the national fabric. Bolsonaro's approach signaled a clear departure from the constitutional principles of the new republic. If the difference between the PT and Bolsonaro's approach to government is to be summarized, I would say that while the PT had a crisis management approach, Bolsonaro didn't govern to contain crisis, but he governed through crisis, as became clear during the pandemic. Another way to frame the contrast is that while the PT operates in a crisis containment mode, Bolsonaro embodies the acceleration of crisis. However, a paradox unfolded, as unbridled acceleration under Bolsonaro risked becoming counterproductive from the perspective of business itself. Broadly speaking, capitalism always requires some levels of regulation, some checks and balances in order to save capitalism from capitalists, as Keynes once said. When Bolsonaro defamed the Chinese agribusiness interests were hurt, while unfettered burning of the Amazon rainforest hindered a free trade agreement with the European Union. Overall, the political instability bred by his political style discouraged foreign investment. Furthermore, the political promotion of evangelical fundamentalism, state violence actors, and organized crime offered grim alternative hegemonic prospects. All in all, the paradox is that if the PT government showed that crisis containment does not avoid its acceleration, the record of Bolsonaro's government suggests that the acceleration of crisis does not preclude its containment. This dynamic is illustrated by two examples. At the height of the pandemic, Brazilian Congress imposed, against Bolsonaro government's will, an emergency cash transfer program that paid 4 times more money to 4 times more families than the Bolsa Família program, which was the flagship of the Lula years. The imposition by Congress of a social policy at the peak of a multidimensional crisis that typified Lula's approach exemplifies that the acceleration of crisis may demand its containment. A second example is Lula's acquittal by the same judges who jailed him 3 years earlier. He was jailed in order not to participate in the 2018 elections. Then 3 years later, he was released by the same judges. There were no groundbreaking evidences to the case, so it was a political, so we can only speculate what brought that to happen. But I think this can be interpreted as a move to bring back a viable alternative to Bolsonaro for the 2022 elections. So because when Lula was released from prison, we were at the peak of the pandemic, 3,000 Brazilians dying every day. Nobody saw the end of, the end of the economic was into deep crisis, and nobody saw the end of the tunnel of the pandemic crisis. That's the context when Lula was taken. And Bolsonaro it was clear he was not going to be impeached. So, in other words, I think this can be framed as it can be read as a move in the upper echelons of Brazilian society to bring back the alternative of containment to the 2022 elections. Of course, this is not to say that Lula's election was written on the wall, but it is to say that his 2022 candidacy had broad establishment support. Going back to South Africa now. The Nelson Mandela-led post-apartheid transition has been internationally acclaimed as a success. The escalation of long-time grievances into civil war at a moment when popular rebellion and state repression reached peak levels was prevented. However, pacification rested on contradictory stands, since black South Africans were given hopes of meaningful change, while their white counterparts were reassured of structural continuities. For the time being, black wrath was subdued, as was the specter of white flight. Politics of containment could not have been staged more literally. However, if black economic empowerment was devised initially as a sort of a contradiction containment device or a contradiction containment scheme underpinning multiracial democracy in place, for example, of white property expropriation, the radicalization of black economic empowerment has led to state capture, ultimately clashing with the Rainbow Nations framework that fostered this black economic empowerment in the first place. Under Zuma, the South Africa's constitutional settlement was presented as an obstacle to radical economic transformation. So if black economic empowerment was part of the crisis containment approach in the first place, the acceleration of black economic empowerment ultimately clashes with the Rainbow Nation settlement. These contradictory dynamics are also seen in relation to markets. As we know, state capture took advantage of new techniques of outsourced government, such as public-private partnerships. This was only made possible by the high level of outsourcing of government's functions in previous governments, under the influence of a new public management approach, which introduced business principles into government structures to make them efficient. So goes the discourse. This approach was a demand from markets to modernize public management in line with neoliberalism. So, a market-driven approach under Mandela and Mbeki set a key condition to state capture under Zuma. On the other hand, markets tried to contain the acceleration of state capture. As you know, When Zuma's finance minister, Nene, was fired for resisting to a controversial nuclear deal and replaced by a Gupta-linked ANC backbencher, confidence in the government plummeted, along with the value of the rand. Calm was only restored when the new minister was replaced by Pravin Gordhan, who was then fired 2 years later under similar circumstances. But by then, a multi-front backlash against state capture was already taking off in the streets. So Zuma was eventually ousted, and Ramaphosa's triumph was widely perceived as a victory for the rule of law, democracy, investment, and growth. As with Lula's comeback, Ramaphosa's election could be framed as a backlash to contain the depletion of the Rainbow Nation settlement. However, he faced a paradox. Ramaphosa would need to establish a stable coalition in order to achieve his stated goals of ending corruption and attracting international investment. But this would require him to incorporate figures involved in corruption, which in turn would strengthen resistance to his anti-corruption measures and ultimately generate new instability. So I'm giving some examples of this contradictory dynamics playing out in the South African case. Clearing the ANC of its rotten apples was hardly a new challenge under Ramaphosa, as the trajectory of former Free State Premier Ace Magashule explains. I will not go into details on that. You probably know him and his trajectory much better than I. Just all that I want to point out is that when you look at his trajectory at Free State, there was a constant a drive by the ANC leadership, or by Mbeki, in the Mbeki's years, to prevent him from becoming the premier of the Free State. But then the power dynamics within the ANC also forced him to always have Magashule at a key government cabinet position. And over time he built his networks and his clientelistic approach and so forth, so to a point where he was just an unavoidable person. And so when the tide turned, he was ready to surf it. He was in the same surfboard as Zuma, as we all know. So the argument here is that the attempt to contain him could not prevent him his politics to actually ending up imbricating the party at a national level. In fact, the impossibility of further containing contradictions within the ANC has led to explosions and splintering. The political trends embodied by Julius Malema and Jacob Zuma, or by Carl Niehaus, I don't have the detail to go to, but an Ace Magashule, but the political trends that these figures embody, they cannot be contained because they point against the Rainbow Nation framework. As tensions and fault lines once contained within the ANC spilled over to engulf society, the political divide was displaced. As a result, after decades being at odds with each other, the ANC and the DA found themselves on the same side of the political divide in the outcome of the 2024 elections, in defense of the institutional arrangement upon which their political faith ultimately stands. So some reflections before I move to my final point. So despite radical economic transformation rhetoric, it seems to me that Afrikaner nationalism, state capture, which peaked under apartheid, that kind of state capture was closer to what we see today happening under the BJP-led Hindu nationalism in India than to Zuma-led state capture. In what sense? In the sense that economic interests in the apartheid case and also in the BJP case, these economic interests are intertwined with ideology and are portrayed at the service of a national vision. And anyway. In these cases, state institutions were repurposed according to an ideological project that goes beyond rent-seeking. So although there seems to be the sort of a vision or an ideology underpinning the state capture, this was very thin, and it didn't translate into all the realms of the public sphere. I might be wrong, but I'd like to debate that later. So the ideological thinness of Zuma-led state capture is exposed by its focus on institutions instrumental to rent-seeking. Although inroads were made to capture media outlets and misinformation became rampant when the government was cornered, cultural war played a secondary role. In South Africa, the boundaries of public debate were not reshaped and shifted to the right in a way comparable to Modi's India and to Bolsonaro's Brazil. In those countries, hate speech has been normalized and politics has become infested with religious tropes. Although Malema and Zuma are pushing the boundaries in that direction, as I'll soon discuss. Conversely, these processes, Bolsonaro and Zuma, converge insofar as Zuma's assault on state institutions can be perceived as a sort of a silent coup. Although the Trumpist-inspired storming of Brasilia that followed Lula's third election, Lula swearing in as president in January 2023, was hardly silent. The second comment is that, seen from an economic angle, these assaults on democracy respond to a very different rationale from 20th century authoritarian national development, which implied long-term industrialization-oriented state planning and intervention. In the face of structural constraints on expanded accumulation, a short-term logic imposes itself. Under Bolsonaro and Zuma, Pulança's argument for promoting the general interests of capital, which may differ from the short-term interests of the dominant class, but are compatible with the long-term political hegemonic goals, this argument becomes anachronic. So it's just only short-term. So accordingly, both governments showed appalling state management capacities tending towards collapse. In both governments, the capacity of state institutions was severely undermined by the repurposing, mismanagement, and outright destruction. Both had a preference for informal shadowy settings, ranging from the Gupta Saxon Bolshevik to the self-styled hate cabinet, headed by one of Bolsonaro's son, which was responsible for the president's social media and digital campaigns, including the professional production of fake news. In different ways, Bolsonaro and Zuma spawned an atmosphere of lawlessness, graft, and institutional dysfunction, which favored business sectors that thrive in such an environment, both legally and illegally. But the instability they produce may ultimately go against the general interests of capital, and a backlash is due. The acceleration of crisis demands its containment. Moving on to the last part now. So this outlined dynamic between containment and acceleration may give the impression of a pendular movement, coming back and forth. But this is not so. The difference between contention and acceleration is not of direction, but of pace. It is not a pendulum, but a corrosive spiral. Hence, the conditions faced by Lula into 2023 are different from those in his first presidency 20 years earlier, just as South Africa's contradictions have been sharpened since Mbeki's days. This corrosive spiral is at the heart of the legitimacy challenges hinging the interregnums discussed. It is also key to comprehend the emerging forms taken by contestation. And we'll see that Zuma, Malema, and Bolsonaro might have more in common than one might expect. So I'll just outline one key aspect to that comparison. In the text, there are more aspects. The specificities of South Africa's multi-layered history add ethnic complexities not found in Brazilian right-wing politics. Likewise, migration influxes from neighboring countries play no significant role in the South American country, as it does in South Africa, where xenophobia has been entrenched. Despite the specificities of each context, Bolsonaro and Zuma share an essential political feature. Both portray themselves as permanent victims of obscure conspirators, often framed in idioms of spiritual warfare. Confronted with the juridical process or political criticism, many supporters cast them as multi-messiah figures, corroborating a public sphere where religion and politics mingle. Bolsonaro gained support among subaltern groups in Brazilian society due to the entanglement of new charismatic ethics, neoliberal subjectivities, and popular conservatism, just as the convergence between neo-Pentecostal ethics and patriarchal shamelessness embodied by Zuma worked in his favor in South Africa. As a result, both countries face an increasingly Pentecostalized public culture. Malema's EFFs can be likened to Bolsonaro in odd ways. When Bolsonaro bashes the Congress, the judiciary, the corporate media for the self-interest hypocritical operating modes, one has to consider he has a point. In like manner, black economic emancipation, land reform, exposing parliamentary elitism, and denouncing Zuma's corruption are all commendable critical stands. As with Bolsonaro, one has to concede that the EFF has a point, or many points. And unlike Bolsonaro, EFF politics are grounded on 20th century left revolutionary repertoire. Yet, there seems to be more bringing these opposite political poles together than apart. If innovation is to be found in EFF politics, this is closer to the right than to the left. In Bolsonaro's fashion, Malema's discourse is an apologetically coarse, serving as a mark of distinction from the high politics of the elite. Foremost, spectacle is enacted through the production of images. Like Bolsonaro, the EFF dominant approach has been disruption. In line with that, Malema consistently resorts to provocative and racially charged language. Just to clarify, the point here is not to disapprove or approve of polarization per se in a society as unequal as South Africa. The point is to signal that Malema's political appeal does not fit into the rainbow nation framework, being symptomatic of a hegemonic crisis. Polarization may result from political radicalization grounded on a deeper understanding of social contradictions, just as happened, with Stephen Biko, black consciousness movement in the 70s. There was polarization as well, but it was of a totally different kind. However, polarization may also operate to simplify social contradictions in devious politically manipulated ways. In those cases, polarization raises reality complexities in favor of simple binary worldviews, laying the ground for straightforward political agendas against clear enemies. And the fabrication of enemies and public attention diversion controversies has been the staple of Bolsonaro's politics, or Bolsonaro's trademark. Perhaps the EFF's aesthetical and discursive reenactment of the liberation struggle fulfills a comparable longing for simplification, albeit with a changed political sign. So to conclude, South Africa's 2024 elections confirmed the decline of the National Liberation Party's hegemony. However, the two most significant new contenders to emerge are splinters from the ANC itself. So one might ponder whether, in a broader sense, the ANC hegemony is morphing rather than fading. So they all come in the EFF and MKP, they come from the ANC. So can't we think that maybe, the ANC hegemony is still there, but with in a different combination? This is not what I think so. Then this is not so, because the ANC's faith is tied to that of the rainbow nation settlement that these offshoots actually undermine. So the unspoken rationale behind the ANC teaming up with the DA in a government of national unity is to safeguard this framework, no matter how long it lasts. In fact, the instability surrounding the coalition further exposes a hegemonic crisis. The rise of Zuma's MKP and Malema's EFF sheds light on the aspirations that the Rainbow Nation settlement has fostered and those it has quenched. Schematically speaking, Zuma proceeds from the individual aspirations this settlement fostered, while the EFF stems from collective aspirations it quenched. But reality is more complex. Having been together as one in Polokwane, Zuma and Malema are not far opposed as left and right political conventions might suggest. In fact, these political strands intertwine. Signaling a change in the spirit of times, Zuma's shamelessness points to an individualistic consumerist ethic overcoming the collective rights-based values that guided the Freedom Charter ANC. At the same time, his MKP party has campaigned for land expropriation as championed by the EFF. Conversely, the EFF's disruptiveness invokes Freedom Charter values that were left behind by the ANC. However, as with Zuma, Malema understood that poor black people often interpret an affluence and material sophistication of political leaders as a mark of aspiration. Bling became part of a political style. Malema's radical stands are soaked in an individualistic consumerist ethic, being instrumental to his ladder climbing ambitions. And I believe that explains a paradox. The paradox is that despite espousing genuine causes, Malema lacks the authenticity that Zuma and Bolsonaro exude. In the end, Zuma's and Bolsonaro's political game may come down to saving themselves by blackmailing the establishment, threatening to bring havoc to the country. Nevertheless, Zuma's stepping on tribalism, ethnicity, and violence seems unlikely to go national at this moment, while Bolsonarismo as a social phenomenon has gained a life of its own. South Africa's fraught landscape is compounded by the EFF. We may ask ourselves, what kind of left politics could emerge in South Africa when revolution was out of place and anti-establishment politics had been captured by the right, by the far right? Lacking historical grounding, revolutionary politics frozen in 20th century modes could only be performed as spectacle. The enactment of a military national liberation movement is sprung up as a performative device to compensate for real impotence to reinvent and challenge social structures. Like Bolsonaro and the MKP, the EFF might not be the way out of the hegemonic interregnum. I don't think it is. However, I do believe that they both are pointing in the direction of things to come.
Thanks, Fabio. And you actually ended on the note I want to open the discussion with, and that's of difference being at the center of comparative studies, not always similarity. So thanks for that. I also just want to acknowledge the presence of another colleague, comrade from Brazil, Rui Braga, who's also been part of this comparative research project since 2016. And also acknowledge others. I mean, all of you, I think there's a really interesting group in the room. And we're also trying to reconstitute our community, especially post-COVID, through the different forms of engagement we've been having as SWOP, but also taking into recognition or recognizing that we're very different generations that come together in these sessions, and very different communities are constituted through our different kinds of engagements. So I want to open up by just throwing into the room a question around the rainbow nation, because I think there are different generations in the room who relate to that very differently. Also got people here who have written about this for a long, long time. And have been, I'm not going to answer the question, I'm just going to throw it out there. I think that as a starting point, and then also to think of us as having a conversation rather than just directing the questions at Fabio. So open for comment also. And if you could just introduce yourself so everyone knows who you are and where you come from before making your contribution. I'm sure there are lots of people who want to speak. I've seen faces. Yeah, cool. Here we go. Sorry, wait for the mic because we're recording this and we'd like to be able to hear you after this.
Greetings. Lesedi speaking. Doing my Masters of Commerce in Inequality Studies at the Southern Center of Inequality Studies. You spoke about, thank you for your speech. You spoke a lot about the world kind of leaning towards the right, right? And then you mentioned a quote from Keynes when you said regulation is needed to save capitalism from capitalists, right? And so I was, so that gave me the impetus to ask the following question, right? To kind of stop this or to kind of mitigate this right-wing wave. It's how do we save democracy from Democrats? That's my question.
Also, if you want to respond to any of the questions that are being posed or comments made.
Good afternoon. My name is Terence Nzuza. I come from the TV arts department. I'm more interested in the visual, and I think there's other parallels that we can draw between South Africa and Brazil. I think one of them is that in Brazil we have a majority of people with the African gene. perhaps it's a response towards, I don't hear much about Ramaphosa's scandals, like, I mean, the famous one of the mattress, and I'm hearing more about Zuma. Perhaps how then can you, strike a balance? And I think the jargon from the news, it looks as if, it sounds as if much of the stuff has been withdrawn, has been drawn from news. So yeah, I'm quite worried with how, like, with your source in terms of how consistent are your source in making these relations.
Thank you, Fabio. I just want to click. I'm Gordon Yegelo. Yeah, I'm not a student here. I'm just a curious retired somebody. If I heard you clearly, at some stage you were saying that the ANC's fate is tied to the National Rainbow Framework, and that made me to think that you are therefore saying that the GNU is sort of an heir to the National Rainbow Framework. What I wanted then to understand was, would you say we should expect that the GNU as an heir to the National Rainbow Framework is likely to resolve the structural problems that South Africa has? And what indicators to that can you point out for me?
Thank you, Prishani, for framing this as more of a conversation than as a questions and answers. It's very risky, for somebody from abroad to actually bring some vision on a country that one knows so little. Although I've been here since early the year, the beginning of the year, I want to first say that I acknowledge South Africans' complexities very much, and I would like, as I said, to spend more time and to go deeper into them. So, I feel, So I'll be very happy to actually hear criticism. There are things that I might, I might get may have gotten wrong impressions of things because it's not, I've not lived through those things. So. Then going to the questions, yeah. So, Lezeri, how do we save democracy from Democrats? That, like, it depends on what. So, my perception, and this goes beyond Brazil. Okay, when you look at the U.S., I'm going to answer in a different way. When you look to U.S. relations to Latin America in the current context, the imperialism seems to be upside down. In what sense? In the sense that particularly U.S. Democrat administrations, they're supporting and they're lining up with the left governments in Latin America. And then how are you to understand that? This seems like this is upside down. So my broad understanding of this issue is that in many cases, particularly like if you look to Central America, during the Cold War, the US was concerned about markets and revolution in Central America. In the 21st century, they're concerned about drugs and migrants. And in order to contain the flux, the production of migrants and drugs in Central America, this broad set of sophisticated social policies that a government like the PT implements is much better than the kind of Bolsonaro politics, that just, where unbridled possibilities of capital accumulation. So in that sense, this alignment between, let's say, U.S. Democrat governments and Latin American governments could be seen as an attempt to save, so to speak, this white liberal world. So if we're talking about saving this democracy, this is what's being proposed. But then we can also discuss how to, what is this? Is this a democracy, and how to overcome, or how could we think of democracy in different ways? But yeah. So to your question about Ramaphosa's scandals, is a very. I really appreciate your question, because I'm not sure, but I'll give you some. So one thing that struck me. So perhaps this explains. It has to do with my argument, actually, because if corruption scandals under Ramaphosa do not have the same consequences as under Zuma, we may think that it's because the Ramaphosa government responds to deeper interests that the Zuma government was not, or was threatening, but not in the sense of revolution or a black economic transformation, but in the sense that I was just referred. That is, if you bring this like state capture, or if it goes against the constitutional framework, then it's a different matter. So this is one possibility. And I also want to point out that it's interesting to think that corruption has played a reversal role in the South African and in the Brazilian case, because corruption has been very much used as a label against the PT. Like there were all those corruption scandals that have been unveiled and unpacked and investigated, and the investigations was very targeted against the PT. So while Bolsonaro and Bolsonaro's government, which is far more corrupt, has not been labeled has come out unscathed in that sense. So it's food for thought. Like and then if the JNU is likely to resolve. So my thinking is what I try to bring out here. So I'm thinking of a sort of a corrosive spiral. So the point that I'm making here is that those, so to speak, politics of containment, they're unable to reverse the social disembedding trends that are inherent to neoliberalism, and this is social dynamics which are not voted for. They are producing hate, fear, and indifference in a large scale, and this is, let's say, the social grounding, the social culture for this different brands of hate politics that we see breeding worldwide. So this can be either, let's say, so it's a matter of pace. You can either go slowly in the social disembedding trends, or you can go faster. But the trend, the sense of the trend remains unchanged. So that's why I don't think that any of these containment alternatives, they're looking from the Brazilian perspective. I'm not going to speak about the South African perspective. They are far better. Yeah, I'm far happier to have Lula as a president than Bolsonaro. So I'm not saying that doesn't make a difference, not at all. But what I am saying is that if you look at the long run, so I'm 100% sure the next Brazilian election we're going to have a wide array of far-right political alternatives, and unless Lula can still have a fourth life of his own, we're doomed. And that's going to be for good. That's why I tried to I brought the Indian comparison. Like it wasn't like a one-time thing, but once it happened, now India is in for a hard time for a long time. It has been, yeah. So with that said, so I don't think the JNU is going to resolve. Yeah. The corrosion there. So just one last point. So what I also observe in different contexts is that then to to go against this, let's say, the acceleration of crisis trends, what we see is the formation of ever broader fronts that are aligned along the defense of democracy, ever broader values, defense of liberty, of democracy. So we have ever broader fronts to defend ever thinner, let's say, social conquest. So so when I look at the ANC now teaming up with the DA, so I see a front that is getting broader. So that's my perception.
Thanks. Thanks. Can you hear me? Dale, I'm going to come to you now, but I'm going to smuggle in a question from the chair. Because, I've read the working paper, and there's a lot you're doing that's very useful, Fabio. But I also want you touch on race, and I think the way that you're speaking about the idea of the rainbow and how it plays out in South African politics post-1994 is interesting. But there is also a real need to think that idea of the rainbow and how it functions post-1994 in relation to the historical tradition, particularly in the African National Congress, or the Congress tradition, an idea of non-racialism that then plays itself out in that early 1994 period in a way that allows for ideas that emanate from the Freedom Charter, etc., to come together with a very neoliberal agenda. And I wanted to ask if there's a way of thinking that in relation to questions of race in Brazil, in terms of what you've presented.
Yeah, thanks, Fabio, for that. Two things I wanted to pick up. One, which is, to me, the ultimate irony of the pseudo-radicalism that is pushed by MK and AFF and others, in which there's this sense that if you say the right things and you say radical things, well, they'll come to be, when in fact your actions and what you're saying undermine the very, very basis upon which you could carry out any kind of program. So what it seems to me what you're saying as well is that in the case of South Africa, unlike India, unlike in the other cases, real fascists are very serious politicians. They take the state very seriously. They take power very seriously. The right wing and the populist here don't, for the most part, because they've done exactly the same. They've undermined the very basis upon which you can roll out a social program, where you can run state-owned enterprises efficiently and to deliver the goods energy-wise and transport-wise and in the ports and everything else, where you can actually have a rural agrarian program that provides support to small-scale and medium-scale black farmers and actually allows them to grow things, as opposed to just talking about expropriation as if this is some radical policy that's going to just immediately create equality. So here's the conundrum, is in South Africa we don't have a serious right wing in the sense of a sort of neo-fascists who take the state very seriously, who are there, which you do have in many other cases. And that, to me, is part of the reason why the ruling elites and the capital here understand that they don't have to take them that seriously. Whereas the sort of threat is the violence and the disorder and the disruption to accumulation. But it's not a threat on the state per se. In that case, at least it seems to me, in the differences between the different rights. The second thing, of course, is that you didn't mention, but it seems to me that one of the things that Bolsonaro, the Zumas, to some degree Malema, and others all across the right, I'm going to take the quote that you have here in your paper from Zuma, and I'm quoting from him. "If it were up to me and I made the rules, I would ask for 6 months as a dictator. You would see wonders. South Africa would be straight. That's why you give me 6 months, allow me to be a dictator, you would be amazed. Right now, we have to make decisions. You have to consult. You need collective petitions, resolutions. That's a lot of work." So in other words, screw democracy. Screw everything else. We talk in the name of the people. We are about the people, but we don't really care about the people because just we want to do it ourselves. And that kind of politics is a Bolsonaro politics. It's a Modi politics. It's a Zuma politics. It's a politics in Europe of Meloni, of all the right-wing candidates across Europe, as well as Trump. And here's the key question for South Africa is a lot of that when you become and you wanted is based upon the military. You made that in the context of Brazil. You can see it in the United States. But here, our military, just like most other state institutions, has been hollowed out. It would be incapable of doing much of anything other than containing a little bit for corporate capital. So in this case, even if you have a situation where someone is voted in and wants to do that, their capacity to actually control the social sphere and control the political economic sphere has been undermined by their very own actions. That seems to me to be one of the core things that is coming out of yours, which I think is an important point to make.
I just wanted to thank you for your presentation and for the research that you've done on Brazil and South African politics. We actually had a conference which was similar to this last year. I think it was like March, April last year, by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies that focused on the political similarities and differences between Brazil and South Africa. And there was a professor from the University of Sao Paulo who was actually here, and also there were some local, professors who were also part of the discussion. So from my take from today's presentation, you spoke of politics of containment by the GNU, and of course neoliberalism from our local context. When we look at Bolsonarism, which is more or less radical, extremist, and ideological, that philosophy of disturbing the narrative. Do you think the US presidential election, which is going to take place in 17 days' time, is going to increase Bolsonarism in Brazil and also have an influence on South African politics by increasing radicalism, especially with those disruptive political elements? Do you think a Trump presidency could actually bolster those kind of mindsets and ideologies?
Okay. I don't think I have anything substantial to say about race, which is already a comment on itself, on the secondary role that race has on the analytical frameworks of many Brazilian scholars, including myself. And I hope to change that, at least in part, going back after this experience that I had here, and also getting in touch with different, because this is something that, like you just alluded to, like the other side of it is saying that obviously lots of things have changed since '94. So I'm just trying to I'm trying to understand the dynamics or where it is. I'm not judging, yeah. I'm not making any sort of assessment, but just looking at looking at the limits and the choices that were made there, and how did that unfold in practice, and where does this seem to be pointing to? But it does from as a Brazilian, like the first thing that strikes when going back to Brazil is how blacks continue to be largely excluded from at so many levels. That includes the university, that includes business, and so Yeah. So my comments here would only be that yeah, we feel. I think as a Brazilian, I feel ashamed of my country and of myself in that sense. Regarding Deo's comments, there's one thing. First, so if we move the discussion, like your comment and the last comment, asking about the U.S., they referred to this broader trend of a world going right. Yes, so. And one question that I ask myself, often being here in South Africa and trying to get a better understanding of other African contexts while being in South Africa, is why this brand of politics hasn't really got on track in Africa as opposed to Asia and to Latin America and Eastern Europe, for example. I have some ideas around that, but the comment that I want to make first, the military is key, I think, in most former third world contexts, but it's not key, for example, if you look at Hungary, where Orban has been in power for very long. So what I've been looking at different contexts, we see that it's a plastic. It's plastic in the sense that it can get many different forms and shapes and faces. So I wouldn't single out that possibility just because of the military has a different role. But I do think that at a different level, yeah, the political dynamics in Africa in general and in South Africa in particular have not been conducive to that specific sort of brand of hate politics. However, as I tried to bring in my speech, we do see like traits, and I try to single out just these two because I think they're foremost in many contexts in the global South, like the way the role that religion is playing, and the role of politics of spectacle. Like the EFF is very different from Brazil because the Brazilian case is very much through digital media, and this is the case in other Latin American contexts as well. So, but the production of spectacle and polarization through hate speech and so forth. These are all, these are like textbook features that you see. So I think these are symptoms, these are signs. And why do I think this is? It's just because it's happening in other countries? No, because then there's another layer to that analysis which I cannot bring into here, which I've discussed it in other writings, which is the social dynamics that produce, this the political culture that actually feeds on or feeds this brand of politics. While, so broadly speaking, the right or the far right was able to sort of reinvent itself and to surf on these desocializing trends, while the left has not, or while the alternative to it has not. So that's what make me think that this is the way we're going. The face that it will take, just don't know. As I don't know, like in Brazil, it's very unlikely to be Bolsonaro as a person again. But last week we had elections for mayor in São Paulo, which is the largest city in Brazil. And what happens? The two candidates that were disputing, there are two brands of far right. And actually, the one furthest to the right is not the one Bolsonaro is supporting. He's a newcomer, a social digital influencer who was completely unknown, well, at least to me, like 3 months ago. And he is to the far right of Bolsonaro. Yeah. And so it's like the Hydra, so many heads, so many faces. And then you look at the left and you only see Lula. So of course this is going right. It's just a matter of time. It's like a ticking bomb. So this is a truth. So I read the current government, Brazilian government, as a truce. Violent social dynamics, which are, So it's because of that broader framework that I think I'm under the impression that South Africa is it's going that way. But then can take so many. But we just have to think, discuss, and try also to, of course, see how to counter those initiatives. And then the last comment I want to make, talking about the USA, but obviously it will have a huge influence if Trump wins. The two comments. The first is like, I think it's a very different thing to elect Trump in the first place. Like when he was first elected, I could really get the point. Like if I was a white redneck, in Kansas, or I can see the point. But then to vote on Trump on a second time, like already knowing what his politics stands for, that's a different matter. And this is what really I think has to have to concerns us, is that and this is another key difference between this right, far right that we're seeing. They're popular. They're mostly voted in. Once they're voted in, they will try in different manners, like to articulate what Gramsci called, consensus and coercion. Yes. So when we're talking about the military, we're talking about coercion. But this is what I didn't really see from the little that I know in Zuma's case, like the attempt of building, like in India, there's this Hindutva thing. So it pervades all society. I didn't really see that, so that this is what would people do. So the culture war. So I didn't see that playing out such a significant, an important role in South Africa. Thanks. Yeah. But I think this speaks to what so you're saying that you're framing it in a different way, like saying that maybe they're not as harmful or threatening, and maybe they're not as capable, maybe as other far rights. And I think this was the case with Bolsonaro in the first place, like when we compare Bolsonaro to Modi or to but if the trend remains, others more capable will come. And the second comment is that when you look, you see this picture, yeah? So this took place just 2 years after the storming of the Capitol in Washington. So obviously there is an inspiration in there. But obviously they took it that like a step further, or many steps further. This was linked to the investigations shown later that it was linked to a coup attempt, a failed coup attempt, half-heartedly supported by the military, by Bolsonaro, but a coup attempt nevertheless. So there's communication, and image production is key, in the imaginations of this far right. So if Trump comes, that's what kind of imaginations, what kind of of course they feed each other, just like the left has fed each other during the 60s or the 70s. Yes, so revolution, yeah. So we're seeing that. So, but the sad thing here, and this is maybe my concluding remark. So there's this book. I found a very, very interesting book by it's a man called Joshua Clover. He's California-based. It's called Riot, Strike, Riot. So basically, the argument that he's making, he says that before the Industrial Revolution, so the way that workers revolted was mostly through riots. Then there was the age of, industrialization. So there was strike was the key. And then since the undoing of industrialization, which is also a global trend, he says, so the times of riot is coming back. And so he's also saying that because of that, so revolution, he's also tying that argument with revolution, the way we thought of revolution in the 20th century. So he's saying, so this is also going away because this was tied to a certain sort of labor or workers' revolution. So the thinking that comes to my mind when you look at this kind of, is that revolution has been perverted. Yeah. So yeah, it's because they have popular support, they build on this social disembedding trends, and they build but then once they try to do both. Yes, coercion, yes, state capabilities and consent, but consent is a big part of it, and this is what really I think should concerns us the most.
Thanks, Fabio. Thanks to all of you. I mumbled a little bit at the beginning about the Global South, but I just want to make the point that I actually set out to make, which I think relates to something you said about, my question about race and the inability for us to actually center it. But I think that is part of the production of us being located in universities where our thinking has been framed by the global north, and our relationships to each other as those who work in the global south often and mostly happen and are mediated through the global north. And this has been a particularly valuable research project, the BRICS project, because we've been able to do work without that kind of mediation. So Fabio, I think it's a really good start, and I think we're also picking up lacks, gaps, questions, concepts that need more rigor, and that we're also thinking across our different programs in which there are many different disciplinary and methodological approaches at play. So I think not to see this as the start and end of a single conversation, but as part of a much, hopefully longer set of engagements that we're part of. So thank you, everyone. This is the last lunch break for the year. But it doesn't mean the last lunch break ever. So look out for our program for next year. And please make sure you've signed the register so we have your contacts. And yeah, keep looking out on our website. And I'm told it's a surprise, but there's tea and coffee and cake outside. So no need to stop the conversation now. Thanks, take care.